Hey everybody, it's me, Buster Green, and today I'm going to talk about a low-budget Japanese drama soap opera series called Extremely Inappropriate. It recently aired on the Tokyo Broadcasting Station in Japan, and somehow it got an immediate global simulcast on Netflix. That title feels like a fake translation though. It's way too generic. What was the actual Japanese title? Futeki Setsu ni mo Hodo ga aru, which translates more literally to there's a limit to extreme inappropriateness. Okay, yeah, that's a mouthful, but that's a much more unique and much more faithful Japanese title, I guess. Now, I cover a lot of different Japanese topics. I usually talk about Japanese anime, sometimes I talk about movies, and sometimes I talk about tokusatsu, but it might also surprise you guys that I also occasionally watch the normal Japanese drama shows. Now, these drama shows are pretty much the cheapest form of serialized TV on Japanese television. They have smaller budgets than even the toku shows, and they usually basically just have no money at all to operate. I haven't seen a ton of these shows, but every once in a while, one gets enough good hype to slip through the cracks, and I randomly watch one every couple of years. I've seen the otaku dating classic Densha Otoko, which was a huge pop culture phenomena back when it came out. It was so big, it even affected the Japanese release of Napoleon Dynamite. Looking back at it now, it wasn't that great a TV series, aside for its hook of being a true story, which was true, and having a couple of funny Gundam references. I also briefly watched a few episodes of that show about the bondage cop before realizing that every single episode was exactly the same story, a guy just tying up bad people and torturing them with bondage. Then last year I watched the brutal Inside Mari, which I ended up not doing a review of because it was just a completely brutal show with a totally insane twist. It started off tackling issues of transgenderism and gender dysphoria and incel culture before spiraling into madness, schizophrenia, and psychological horror. So that was not a sweet cup of tea, I'll tell you that much. Oh, and yeah, there was also that weak-ass Gundam drama battle show I watched with the bad CGI Gundam battles. I did review that one. Here's the link. Anyway, so yeah, this year's drama is Extremely Inappropriate. Now, I wasn't planning on watching this one, but Netflix licensed it, Netflix suggested it to me, and something about it just jumped out at me. And to boil down what that was as quickly as possible, this is a 10-episode Japanese drama, mostly based around the classic film Back to the Future 1. And I strictly mean Back to the Future 1, not the Back to the Future trilogy, because there's no Biff Tannen, there's no flying cars, and there's no cowboys involved. So, light spoilers ahead. But on the basis that I'm guessing no one except me has seen the show, I will try to stay off some of the best twists the show has to offer, because I really think this is a pretty fun show for the twists. Now, what's interesting is, once again, I have to point out that there's been this weird global yearning in the psyche of the world to revisit Back to the Future. I think it's just because it's been over 40 years, but I'm pretty sure Robert Zemeckis, the director of Back to the Future, has put a complete prohibition of any idea of a sequel. So there can be no sequel, there can be no remake. His policy is that as long as he lives, they cannot make any more of this movie. And yeah, that's a pretty weird law to put into place, but somehow society is just finding a way to fill that gap and jump around it. And so as such, we've had such weird recent mutations as the Back to the Future musical. Haven't seen it, heard it's funny. And then we have all the recent different Back to the Future video game tie-ins over the year. And the biggest and most important Back to the Future callback that we've had lately is Rick and Morty. Now, I would honestly say that this show and Rick and Morty are in a weird way kind of paradoxical cousins. If you consider all the main points and main concepts of Back to the Future, and then you consider that Rick and Morty pretty much just took out the relationship of Doc and Morty and made an entire show about that, Extremely Inappropriate takes out the rest of it. And what's left in Back to the Future after you take out Doc and Morty? Well, apparently all that's left is the DeLorean and the incest. And I have to say, Extremely Inappropriate is a pretty wild ride, because for all intents and purposes, this is as close as we're ever going to get to an unofficial Japanese Back to the Future remake, or close enough inspired project. Here's the direct connection, because there is a direct connection in the show. The show is about a man who builds a time machine in the year 2024, and he uses its time machine to connect the year 2024 to 1984. But the reason he builds this time machine in the first place is because he fully got the idea from the movie Back to the Future in 1984. And instead of building a DeLorean, he ends up building a time bus, which is basically just a bigger DeLorean. So yeah, what I'm saying is this is pretty much as close as we're ever going to get to an unofficial Back to the Future sequel, based just on the idea that at this point everyone's seen Back to the Future, and so they're just going to do their own Back to the Future because we've seen it already. That makes sense, right? Back to the Future was a movie everyone saw, so yeah, you could do it yourself. Why don't you? So yeah, also this was the premise of like Human Centipede 2, right? I didn't see that movie either, but yeah, it's kind of nuts that you can just get away with making your own unofficial backdoor sequel to Back to the Future with this sort of loophole. It's fun like that. Anyway, so yeah, the show is overall pretty nuts. It's about a lot of different things. It's about this time travel mechanism, which is this local bus. And instead of a bus that goes like back and forth from like your house to like the mall, this is a bus that time travels back and forth between 1984 and 2024 every day at 3:55 p.m. And yeah, they were pretty much just going for a ripoff of the DeLorean thing, but because their budget is limited, it's just a normal city bus piloted by a mannequin. I'm not really sure if the mannequin is the time travel device or like what they did to it to make it a time machine, but you know, you gotta suspend your disbelief there. The main character of the show is a shitty, abusive, troll-spirited sleazebag middle school teacher named Mr. Ogawa. This guy is the main character of the show, and he's a pretty wild character. He beats his students with baseball bats, he honks women's tits for fun, he's a complete 1980s chauvinist pig, and he lives in Tokyo with his sexy badass Sukuban daughter Junko. Now, somehow their world gets turned upside down when one day they are randomly invaded by this ultra-feminist progressive mom from 2024 and her extremely sexually repressed son. Now, this leads to some major nonsense going down because the 2024 mom and her son agree to basically do an old switcheroo with Ogawa. They decide to move into his apartment, and Ogawa decides to move into 2024. Junko, meanwhile, ignores the situation, but does eventually have a short-lived fling with the 2024 boy. So yeah, Ogawa, meanwhile, goes to the year 2024, decides he immediately hates the Apple AirPod, he hates everyone using them, but he does figure out how to use a smartphone, and then he nearly gets arrested for smoking cigarettes outside in the daytime. In 2024, Ogawa meets a single mom named Nagisa, about his age, who he falls in love with, and then through a series of very stupid events, he fails upwards until he unwittingly becomes the human resources counselor for a modern-day major television network. I believe it's Tokyo Broadcasting Station because that's the channel making this. So anyway, it ends up in a situation where Ogawa gets to directly comment on how ass-backwards modern-day TV is to the faces of the people who are making it, and that's kind of the show. He then spends the next at least 8 out of 10 episodes of the show mentally learning about and comprehending the landscape of 2024, what's going on with society, what's going on with politics. He has to suddenly deal with wokeness, cancel culture, modern day homosexuality, and most importantly, just everyone acting like snowflakes and crying over things that are kind of ridiculous. The problem basically that the show is trying to point out is that people nowadays are getting overly offended over pretty much anything, and so Ogawa is here to face this. And each episode pretty much puts him into a spiral of depression and rage until he eventually formulates a hot take about how stupid and backwards some modern day thing is, or alternatively, he learns to accept it and becomes a better person. Now, the main points the show seems to be getting at are that on the one hand, Japanese television is inherently abusive and manipulative as an industry. It creates entertainment from the suffering of others, but on the other hand, steering overly into politically correctness and snowflake harassment issues seem to be resulting in net unproductivity for businesses and that overwhelming feeling of anxiety and shame that everyone's walking on eggshells all the time, trying not to piss everyone else off. Anyway, so that's Ogawa's big problem, but the show isn't entirely about that. The main thing the show is about is that considering the time bus just is constantly going back and forth between 2024 and 1984, the show basically treats Reiwa Japan and Showa Japan as somehow two completely different but loosely related countries. And so it ends up treating them in the end like sort of like a foreign exchange sort of context. Like each episode essentially boils down to a random character from the cast getting on the time bus and traveling to either Reiwa or Showa, and then experience culture shock and having a life-changing epiphany by getting out of their usual routine, and then ultimately just trying to decide if 2024 had it right or if 1984 had it right. Also, Ogawa's badass, kind of stupid Sukuban daughter, pretty much the heart of the show. Kind of one of the main reasons I kept watching it, because she keeps that plot moving along. Although she does sometimes fall into some pretty traditional soap opera heroine cliches. Anyway, she's played by an actress named Yumi Kawai? Really? Cute dream? That's kind of the fakest name I've heard in a long time. Anyway, now I can't fully praise the entire show. Although the show is overall a pretty entertaining ride from start to finish, it has a really good cast, it has some interesting twists. The show somehow succeeds despite having basically no budget. It has one tragic weakness which I have to bring up, and that is that every episode has a goddamn awful musical number. Now, I have no idea why or whose awful idea this was, but every episode almost always ends or climaxes with all the characters stopping what they're doing, some like stage lights coming on, and them doing an extremely elaborate, semi-uncoordinated musical number. Usually the musical number is just blatantly about how stupid the moral and concept of the episode was, and the musical numbers just clash so much with the rest of the show. They break the reality of a pretty bogus show that was otherwise about a time travel bus that allows people to have FaceTime iPhone calls between 1984 and 2024. But yeah, the musical numbers, hands down the worst part of every episode. None of the tunes are catchy. It sure as hell ain't Has Been Hotel, but thankfully there is only one per episode, and they're just literally just laying blankly and blatantly what the moral of the episode is in a way that allows you to consider it and think about it for a minute while the main characters spin around and twirl and dance like idiots. Now anyway, as I mentioned, like the original Back to the Future, this show also deals with incest a lot. So if you didn't like that in Back to the Future, you might not like it here either. I will say though, it is a lot somehow less sexually charged than the original Back to the Future was. And yeah, I don't feel like talking about that anymore, but that's my warning. It's in there. Just be prepared for it. And yeah, moving on from that, the biggest twist of the show is that it's ultimately ended up revealed that the random family that Ogawa has just been instinctively hanging out with 40 years in the future, it eventually turns out that that is literally his own family. Except somehow, unlike Marty McFly, his family has become completely unrecognizable to him. Because what's happened is everyone he cares about has died, and everyone that has died has somehow been replaced either by birth or marriage by brand new people he's never met. So this has ended up creating a situation where no one in his family actually knows who he is, because he's basically been completely erased by history just because no one ever took a picture of him and no one ever talked about him. And the 2024 family, I don't know what to say about them. They're somehow just like really aloof, and they somehow really never cared about their ancestry, because technically outside of this time travel scenario, I guess they never considered knowing about their relatives to be useful info. But yeah, this is kind of one of the biggest, and in my opinion, the most interesting thing the show seems to be getting at, because contrasting and comparing the Ogawas from 2024 and 1984, that for me was the most fascinating part of the show, because there's these two different families. They're both semi-functional, they're both poor, they're both struggling, but on a certain level, even though they both have their own problems, it's just so fascinating to me that in a span of 40 years, this small, poor family became a completely different small, poor family living in the same spot, but with completely different people. Although maybe it's a bit of a plot hole, because by all accounts, thinking deep into the lore of the show, all the family members would have been fully alive and interacting with each other in the early 90s. So the show kind of hangs on this big suspension of disbelief that just no one was prepared for time travel to be developed, and that everyone on the show just completely forgot 100% about all their dead relatives all the time. Anyway, ultimately the show doesn't really settle the debate about which side had it right, which side was better, because the core argument that the show is kind to make is that they were both right and they were both wrong. And so it kind of settles into this weird middle ground, explaining what was good about each side and what was bad about each side. Overall, like taking all the points into consideration, I will kind of say that it does lean a bit on the idea that ultimately 1984 was better than 2024 because people were less sexually repressed. They didn't have the internet, which is usually shown in a negative light in the show because it just creates the fear of cancel culture and causes like society as a whole to become anxious and depressed. But the show doesn't completely let the 80s off either, highlighting how outrageously violent people were back then, how like one wrong move could like get your like ass beat and sent to the hospital, how no one ever bathed. And ultimately in the end, Junko seemingly renounces her Sukeban ways after ultimately realizing that it was a silly, pointless trend in the long run of history. But yeah, this is a fascinating show in my book. Like, hey, I'll ask you a weird question to end this one out. When your relatives die, do you plan on keeping photos of them? And if you don't, are you worried you'll ever forget about them? Because these people did. All right. I was me, Buster Green. Leave a comment if you checked this show out. And yeah, have a nice summer.